Well, we're really thrilled to have returning to the annual conference Professor Jason Carroll of Brigham Young University, Professor and Associate Director of the School of Family Life at BYU. He was here in 2011, I think spoke in this very room at that time. His latest work I flashed earlier, and I'll show you again, not yet, a jointly authored study Professor Carroll did with Professor Wilcox at UVA, Kay Heimowitz, and Colleen Kay. More information on that report, not only the report, but a lot of supporting information, media, and so on, can be found on the website 20somethingmarriage.org. Okay, so you can find that there. Again, I still hope that some of you are tweeting the meeting at SIU 2013 and Millennials for Sexual Integrity hashtags. Professor Carroll is a nationally recognized researcher and educator in the areas of marital intimacy and healthy sexuality, marriage readiness among young adults, the effectiveness of marriage education, and modern threats to marriage, such as pornography, delayed age of marriage, materialism, and premarital sexuality. He's been on the faculty of Brigham Young University for 12 years now. He's also involved with the National Marriage Project, the Relate Institute, the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unplanned Pregnancy. He's been commissioned by the United States Department of Health and Human Services to conduct a study for the National Healthy Marriage Resource Center. At BYU, he's well known as the popular professor of the Preparation for Marriage, or Marriage Prep course, which is taken by over 1,500 students a year at BYU. This is a class that most universities wouldn't even think to offer, and at BYU, where they take these matters seriously, God bless them, 1,500 students a year. You must have a battalion of TAs for that class. Even prouder, I'm sure, than he is of his 12 years at BYU. He's proud of his 20 years of marriage to his wife, Stephanie. They have 5 children. Please welcome Dr. Jason Carroll.
I was nervous. Let me play with mics. Is mics okay? Too loud, too soft? I'm a projector, so it'll get too loud, and you'll be like, tone it down. I was worried being the person who went before lunch. Now I get to be the guy who bumped lunch. That's not a good place to be, right? That clock will tick around, and they'll start getting close to that, and folks say, I don't care what's coming out of your mouth. Now it's lunchtime, right? So, a couple of things. I always have the habit of I need to kind of clear my mind a little bit as I get started and all the things that are rattling around. This is the most urgent and hurried travel I've had, coming out to Princeton, coming out to Love and Fidelity, or to Witherspoon. I was down at the NCFR conference this week down in San Antonio, the National Council for Family Relations. It's the large academic group for family studies, and had my plans all ready to come from San Antonio up here and be with you this weekend. And then my son's high school football team advanced in the state playoffs, so I quickly made a change and headed back to see his game. And the only flight that could get me in here for this morning then was a midnight flight leaving Salt Lake to get out here to be with you. The sad thing of it all is they're a first-year high school, so it was a huge success just to even make the playoffs this year. But they ran up against the number 1 team in the state yesterday, so it was a 59-10 ball game. And my son's comment to me was, I really appreciate you coming, but I'm not sure I wanted you to see that type of approach of it. So anyway, love this conference. I love the work that you're all involved in and connected to. So my hope today is to get us into a discussion around a subject matter that I hope, like all good academics, you're okay with some answers to that question, and then probably more questions that come from that question. And I'll point that out during the discussion. I think we're actually on the cusp of next 5 to 10 years, some needed research, which is a little bit of an odd thing to say around something like the age of marriage. We've been researching that for a long time, but I'll point out to you what it is that's new and what it is that's different. So anyway, the question I want us to spend some time with today is the question, when is the best age to get married? Now my experience is that question gets asked and it takes us all to a very interesting place. It takes us all to our place. And in fact, one of the things I want you to be doing today is thinking about what is your place when it comes to answering this question. How do you answer it for yourself and perhaps for others? But more than anything, I want you to be engaging in some personal reflection around where did you get your place from, right? Where did your answers come from? Because I think in order to include this, and I'll be sharing with you the Not Yet report, and Brad Wilcox and I launched that report mostly because we decided that while there's a lot of conversation going on about the why of marriage, and definitely some conversation about the what and the nature of marriage, we need to include in our dialogue the when issues of marriage as well. And so I invite you to do that. My experience is that when you bring up this question, there are a number of answers, a few answers we could go to. The first one we might call the Oprah and Stedman answer to the question, right? So Oprah's answers to the question of when's the best age to get married is never, right? Now, I think in this context, but also in your conversations with others, while some are embracing this type of post-marriage culture, where marriage is just on the continuum, it's just on the menu, so to speak, and does it even matter? That's really not the pattern we see generally across the country still. We still see very much in favor of marriage culture. So I think that's part of the context we want to set here, and that's probably why we don't want to go to that as our answer. But we do see about 80% of young adults today still rating marriage as an important, most of them as a very important part of their life plans. So I think that's critical to understand. You don't have to necessarily sell people on the notion of a successful lifelong marriage. While some are going in some other directions, the vast majority of our culture continues to see that as a value premium. Another answer might be well, isn't this different for everyone answer? Which is always tempting, and there's probably some of that that's definitely somewhat true, and we'll look at some factors that might create some individual variation. But at its core, if that was completely true, then age of marriage would predict just about nothing. And that's not what we see in the data pattern. So we probably don't want to go back to this is a completely individual, idiosyncratic part of life. There probably are some general patterns, similar to our session we just came from, right? There might be some of that individual variation, but collectively we start to see some patterns that really emerge. The next answer is the average is the right age, right? Right? That's a lot of rights in a sense, right. As we'll look at here in a minute, there's no doubt that many today are getting their definition of on time simply by what is average, okay? Now, two things make me a little bit nervous to go with that type of answer. First off, we have a pretty rapidly moving target right now. And so if that is moving and changing, right, then that's an interesting one for us to think about. Do we want to use that as our definition? The bigger part of me is trained as a developmentalist. I'm really not a big fan of chronological measures of on time, right? Ultimately, we define things as developmentally on time when they are developmentally appropriate and serve a developmental purpose, not simply because of age. So we'll have some of that discussion, I'm sure, today too, that chronological, biological age isn't necessarily maturational age. In fact, as we start to leave the teenage years, those two start to diverge from each other quite a bit. Earlier than that, there's so much going on in that darn brain development that biological and maturational age is usually pretty closely tied. But once we get past that into adult life, we start to see that vary quite a bit. So in some ways, the answer that I think we might work with the most today is in many ways, it's the what do you want to be best at answer. The reality is that there's a lot of different outcomes you can look at connected to age at marriage, and the data patterns are somewhat mixed. So depending on what someone values and what someone wants to achieve, we might see some different answers. So those values and preferences and what matters might help us also start to navigate what would be some of those factors and some of those principles around that. Now, just to make sure we give credit where credit's due, we're going to be looking a lot today at the Not Yet report that's been mentioned. that's on the 20somethingmarriage.org website. The entire report's there if you weren't able to get one of the hard copies. All of the media press that's been done on this is listed on there as well. There's been a website blog that's stayed around the issue. So there's some good information there. Not only we've mentioned the authors of the report, but I think it's important for you to understand the funders and the sponsors of this report, because I think it ties back into one of the questions from this morning's session, right? There was some questions around the scientific approach to a subject matter and the values approach to a subject matter, and can they coexist and how do they fit? To me, one of the key elements of the scientific approach to a subject matter is to try to create some common language bases that people can get around, even if they don't necessarily share all of the same values, but they can find that common ground. This report was funded by the National Marriage Project. Some of you, or most of you, are probably quite familiar with Brad Wilcox's group at the University of Virginia. All right. It was also funded by the Relate Institute at Brigham Young University. Those two being collaborators wouldn't raise too many eyebrows. But the other major funder of this project was the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unplanned Pregnancy. That raises some eyebrows. That's a different set of partners around the table that some would say, oh, conservative. Well, that's a pretty liberal group. Why would that be, coming together? And part of it, I think, is when you work for that commonality. You can start to have some of those partnerships in areas and point that out. So Colleen Kay from the National Campaign was a great asset on this project and brought great perspectives and some partnerships that are really building from that. Okay, so we'll be dabbling in that. There's no way we're going to cover all of that today, but as we move through some things fairly quickly, we'll leave that for some of the references, some of the data details. I really want to hit high-end patterns today and cover some of those things that we'll be pulling from this report. I'm going to break this down into some different subsections. So we're going to look at social impact. Some of that's around context. I think it's important for us all to understand the current context of age of marriage and what is happening in this country, the broader social patterns that we see. Then we're going to look at some of the financial outcomes. There's some very interesting stories there when we look at financial and career preparation. Then we're going to look at issues around personal well-being, and then we're going to come back to marital outcomes and how do marriages fare based on the age of the individuals who form them, and then kind of pull that together. And with some hopes that we can move through that in fairly quick fashion, I'd like us by the top of the hour or a little bit after that to be able to open up and spend most of our time in question and answer and go directions that you think could be most helpful. This is probably not news to anybody, but to refresh ourselves and make sure that we're aware of the patterns here, we see dramatic changes over the last generation or two in this country and in other modern countries around the median age of marriage, right? And it has substantially increased to the point now that we're at an all-time historic high for both men and for women, right? Creating a very different transition and pattern than we see from a couple of generations ago. I spend a lot of my time running around with what's called the emerging adulthood crowd. You've probably heard that term coming up. Jeff Arnett and others have created the new society. There's a Society for the Study of Emerging Adulthood, SSEA. Much of that entire phenomenon of emerging adulthood and what's even being labeled as a discipline is really a product and connected to these demographic trends and patterns that we see. Now, one thing I want to highlight for us, that while we see the historic trends and patterns, also pay careful attention to what's happening in the last 5 to 6 years. What do you see with the trends most recently? Pretty steep climb, right? We saw some really steep climb in the late 70s, 1980s, and then we saw a little bit of a flattening. It was still increasing. We see some sharper increases occurring now. So we see some other things that will help us pay attention to this. Now, please remember, too, this is a national median. We can also go in and look at age of marriage statistics, right, by region of the country, by state, and different patterns. So when you look at the patterns across the country, we already have many parts of the country, particularly in our urban city centers, our states with our larger metropolitan areas, already have averages age of marriage for men and for women above 30. Right? We see a little bit of an area in in the Midwest, where we see some lower ages, and we see one particularly unique state that has particularly low ones. Any guesses? Massachusetts is blowing them all away. No, it's that same place that I teach at, and it also happens to be the valley that is the most fertile valley in the country, too. So we do see that with Utah. We see a little bit different pattern with that. Here's another part, though, of the trends that I'm not sure everybody is as aware of as we see with the age of marriage. This is what we label in the report the great crossover. We have seen a very significant change in demographic patterns in the United States in the last 15 to 20 years. And what we've seen is the median and average age of marriage go above the average and median age of childbirth. So what we see now is that the typical woman in the United States gives birth to a child before she is married. Right? So we see that pattern changing around that. So if you look at this graph here in more detail, so you see the crossover of those patterns, right, as you see the age of marriage moving up, and you see the average age of first birth moving as well, both taking the steep, most recent climb. But if you pay attention to the bar graph at the bottom, that's marking the number of children or percent of children in the United States that are born out of wedlock. Those are our non-marital childbirth rates. And so we are at this tipping point now where 48% of children in America are born out of marriage, meaning the mother is not married at the time the child is born. We will likely see in the next few years that cross that tipping point and move now into the over 50% pattern that we have. So the age of marriage pattern should not be looked at in isolation. They have to be understood in context. They're a part of this overall pattern that we see in our social patterns. Now, I want to show you something to help you really understand this. And this is pretty important because most of us, when we get connected to college campuses, we get connected to campus life, we forget that the majority of Americans don't go to college, right? Or they end up there and they stay there for only a part of that time. So I really want to make sure when you think of these issues that you're keeping a broad, fully social view on this matter. So what I'm going to show you here is that same trends that we were just looking at, but broken down by social economic status. So now we're looking at the median age of first marriage and first birth for women with a college degree. Okay? Do we see a crossover? No, we never have. For college-educated women in this country, we've seen both of those ages increase, right? We've seen a little bit of an increase in non-marital childbirth, but we've seen no crossing over among that demographic. They continue to have a sequence there where we see education patterns, we see marriage, and then we see childbirth. This next graph shows you women with less than high school diplomas. Okay, so these are our high school dropouts in the country. Do we see a crossover? No, because the lines have, for a very long time, already been crossed, right? So notice there's no crossover, but that is the age of marriage here, and this is the average age of first childbirth, right? So that's where we see that portion of that. Those two kind of get put together in that other graph that we saw. But here's the story I want you to capture and get your minds around. This is high school graduates or some college. This is kind of our community college group of women. And notice what we've seen happen. This is where we see that crossover, this middle America. So what we're seeing is our middle American young adults and middle American women in a pattern now that makes them look more like their less educated sisters, not more like they're educated, right? So we see a crossing over. We see spiking increases in the non-marital childbirth. We put all of that together in an entire population, and we see a crossover for the entire group. So I think these patterns have to be a part of what we think about when we look at these trends and these patterns around age of marriage. So as I've been saying, I think there is an element here, particularly connected to child well-being. Somebody brought up in the last session the question about, well, how do you help a department be convinced of? Well, I don't know a simple answer for everything, but child well-being is a good place to start. There's not a lot of people who want to take on child well-being, right? And you can work backwards from there. It's a little bit different if you're coming at marriage just as a marriage and people being satisfied and happy, right? It's important, but that's not as much as when we tie this to that pattern. So when you hear the bio line, it says, oh, did a study for the National Healthy Marriage Resource Center. How would we ever have a national project on healthy marriage trajectories and patterns? It was tied to child poverty levels, right? Because we know the consequences and the reality that we see for children when we see this pattern of 48% of first births to unmarried women. And this crossover is cause for concern because of what we know to be the risks of children born outside of marriage, even to cohabiting couples. We do not see those couples acting the same as marriage. We see disruption rates to be much, much higher. Children far more likely to be exposed to that, to the poverty, the other types of issues that go with it. So we really can see some ways that we can engage in that conversation and that dialogue. But this is kind of the take-home statistic of the front half of the report. That we've reached the point in America now that by age 25, 44% of women have had a baby, while 38% of women have married. So that's indicative of what we see with the great crossover patterns and some of the societal impact. So we can definitely come back and talk a little bit more about those social trends and social demographics. Let's move into some more of the specific individual and couple data that we looked at in the report. To be clear with this report, we only did a little bit of original data collection. We mostly went back to our largest census level data sets, tried to pull out the trends and patterns and look at them in unique ways. So we're dealing a lot with the large secondary analysis patterns in this. Here's one of the parts that we pay quite a bit of attention to. We looked at the impact of age of marriage on women's income and their financial earnings and their career patterns, okay? Now, to orient you to this graph, because it's pretty important for you to pick up the key trends, what you have is those same three social economic groups I just showed you, right? So this is the less than high school crowd, right? This is the high school or some college. And these are our college grads. So we break them into those three groups. And then what you see broken down in our interesting colored rainbow, right? I didn't do the graphics. I guess you have to kind of see the whole report. There's this whole kind of little wood theme going on, the whole knot. Yeah, it kind of, it works. You pop them up here and you kind of go, really? We go straight from green to brown to, how'd that, yeah, it's a little interesting, right? But what you see then, so you get oriented, so we see with this group here is those who married less than 20. The blue then becomes those who married 20 to 23. Red is 24 to 26. The black or darker colored one is 27 to 29. This beige one becomes 30 plus. And then our brown column on the end is women who never married, okay, by the time of that sampling, which is about age 40, okay? So what do we notice? What trends do we see? Let's even go a little bit classroom here. I'm tired of talking. What do you see?
The longer she waits to get married, the more money she makes.
Okay, we definitely see that among which group? Among the college grads, right? They see a little bit different pattern. Things stay pretty flat, but we do see, right, a linear pattern. We see a process there that the longer a college graduate woman waits to marry, the more personal income. Now remember, we can measure personal income and household income, but personal earnings, personal finances, right? We see this type of pattern. So if we were to look at one of the key benefits we've seen in these trends of increased age of marriage, we would see is the benefit to women's career advancement, to degrees, and to their earning potential. Right? So much so that we labeled there being somewhat of a marriage trade-off, right? Women that married earlier in those patterns, we would see them having somewhat of a trade-off. They don't have as much earning capacity as they would otherwise. But the thing I want you to pay most attention to is, so that's a key piece, and we want to hold on to that. I think that's a key finding that we see in the study. But we also want to notice, what's the primary thing here that's determining the personal income of women? It's the education level, right? We see that much more so than age of marriage or timing of marriage. In fact, I could even show you the data, which I won't today. Timing of childbirth is a stronger predictor of this than age of marriage is with that type of pattern. So a couple of trends we want to keep together. Education is extremely important, so put in the backdrop of your mind for something we're going to get to in a minute. It's not just the timing of marriage, it's also what does it facilitate or what does it disrupt in life course and pattern, right? Around some of those types of factors of this. Now that you're oriented to the graph, this is the exact same graph, but this is men's personal income. Do we see the same thing? No. Well, didn't we say this earlier? Gender's a nice place to go. We see some different patterns with that. In fact, in that college-educated group, we see something quite different. Statistically minded people would call that that's a curvilinear relationship, right? We're seeing a pattern there where increase of age of marriage is having some advantage with this variable. We see some increase of that. So we see some lower patterns here for these men that married before the age of 20 in the early 20s. But then we see it peak, and by the late 20s and moving into the 30s, we see it start to come back down. So we see an interesting pattern that we labeled in the report somewhat of a marriage motivator for men. There seems to be something for men that when marriage is coming into the life course a little bit earlier for them, rather than disadvantaging them in their career and financial pursuits, it's acting as a motivator, perhaps to take better opportunity or better make greater use of the opportunities they have. Maybe play a little bit less Halo. Maybe play a little, whatever it might be that's helping them with that pattern. We actually see a different trend there around that. But again, notice with men, what do we see to be the strongest predictor? It's education, right? I mean, even when we see men who marry before the age of 20, if they complete a college degree, right, they're still significantly better off than men who wait until over the age of 30 but only have some college, right? So we don't even see that piece catching up with that or around that. So that's an important piece for us, I think, to keep in mind as well. A couple of other things then. We won't spend as much time with this because this part gets pretty wide-ranging in the report, and I'll let you refer to it. But the key that we've noticed too, right, most of us have heard about, and particularly with a group like this in our discussions of marriage and the benefits of marriage, it's kind of the Linda Waite case for marriage argument. We've seen the social science data. We've seen the statistics that show that married people on average are doing better than the non-married, that married couples have a benefit in a number of areas compared to cohabiting couples as well. So it's not just a social support. It's not just being in a relationship. So one of the central questions we wanted to deal with in this report is that true for 20-somethings? We've never looked at that specifically with those in their 20s, and do we see those benefits? Because one of the key things we see among many young people today is marriage labeled as a transition of loss. And you can think about how that reflects your college campus, if that fits the dialogue that's there. We saw this when myself and Paul Amato and Scott Stanley were doing the work for the federal government. We did some focus groups all around the country with young adults, and we consistently heard, whether it was Nashville, whether it was Boston, whether it was California, we heard people telling the young adults talking about marriage as a transition of loss, right? It was all about what will I lose, what will I have to stop doing, what will I have to give up, type of patterns. It was fascinating because we also did interviews at that time with 20-somethings who had married, and the dominant element of their conversation was marriage as a transition of gain. Here's what's been added, here's what's new, here's what I can do, these types of things that can. We often wondered if we should mix those focus groups and get them talking to each other, because they seem to be talking about some very different notions and ideas. But before we get to the personal well-being data, I want to put something that I think is a critical piece of our understanding here. And it's this idea of the desired age for marriage, right? There's definitely a part of how this is influencing people's well-being ties into, well, what do they desire? What do they want? I've been doing research in this area for a number of years and have been developing what we've labeled as a marital horizon theory, right? This idea that all young people have a marital horizon, right? They have this notion about where is it is it close to them? Is it something that they see happening pretty soon? Is it pretty far away? Is it pretty distant? And the data that's come back on desired age for marriage tells a little bit different story than I think we often highlight for young people today. What we're seeing is some real evidence that the average age and the median age for marriage cannot be seen as completely a matter of choice. Right? The people aren't just dating and forming relationships and marrying when they want to. That there's a number of factors that we're running into that might point to some elements of constraint, some elements of perhaps I would have liked this to be different, but that's how this happens. This is where my friends think about this, my family thinks about this, the guys or girls that I date or the people I associate with is a matter of constraint instead of choice. In the study that I did with college attending young adults all across the country at several different sites, we found a pretty consistent pattern across the regions of the country that the desired age for marriage was 25. We've seen that now replicated in 2 other regional data sets, the Toledo Adolescent Longitudinal Study, I probably just didn't say that right, and then Brian Willoughby's Marital Attitudes Study, connected to Ball State and some other things. So in the Not Yet report, we wanted to see if we could get some national data, get beyond the regional data on this desired age for marriage. Here's what we found, and this is a pretty interesting pattern and one to reflect on in these notions. What we find is that by the age of 25 in the national samples, that 50% of men and 80% of women are either married or report that they wish they were married. Okay, you understand how we get that statistic? So they're either reporting they are married or that they wish they were married. So this means that by age 25, about 25% of men are married, but another 25% are saying they wish they were. In marital horizon language, we call that a negative horizon. They've crossed their horizon, and now their horizon is behind them. Their desired age for marriage isn't in front of them, it's now behind them. For women, what we see in the national samples is that while slightly more than 30% are married by 25, another 50% of women are reporting that they desire to be married but are not. Now, put those numbers too to what we looked at with those median averages, right? The median averages are already 2 to 3 to 4 years higher than that. So there's some good indication here for us when we think about this that we've got to keep that in mind too, that varies for people, but we also see some trends that we may not be noting there, that there may be as much a reflection on our dating culture, or better said, the lack of dating culture and relationship formation culture, and ways that in broader society, maybe we're pushing the marital horizon of young people or encouraging it more than they are. In fact, in my study, we also looked at the desired age for parents, of what they said the best age to marry for their children are. Where do you think it is? Is it below or is it above? It's above. That's a generational shift. The old notion used to be, going home from college and mom saying, so, hey, when's this going to happen for you, right? And maybe not after college, maybe a little bit after college. Hey, when's this going to happen? And, and when's marriage going to happen? Hey, when grandkids going to happen? Now we see a lot of it going the other direction, right? It's the young people trying to get parents on board. We're not crazy. No, we're not mentally insane. I know you're going to try to come up with some reason why he's a really bad guy, but he's really not, right? And so we hear more and more patterns where it's often the opposite. It's the upcoming generation trying to talk the older generations into acceptance and support of the relationship. So that's something else we want to keep in mind here. But in this context, when we look at marriage and personal well-being, we see exactly what we found in the broader literature. When we look at 20-somethings compared to their peers and compared to their cohorts, we see those that are married, right? Particularly as we looked here at those who get into the mid to late 20s and are married compared to those who are not, we see a number of indicators of personal well-being showing that they are doing, on average, better. Now, please remember, we always got to keep all this. This is all probabilities and population statistics, right? The same way, so we understand that's not saying that every married person is doing better, say in this indicator of those reporting that they're highly depressed. We're not saying that every person who's married compared to every person who's not, right? But when we look at those population averages, we see those health benefits there, even in the 20-something cohort. So we looked at this with depression, we looked at this with life satisfaction, we looked at this around risk behaviors, drinking behaviors, physical health, emotional health in the report, so you can go look at all the data. It all followed the hypothesized trend that we've seen for marriage in general, that even among 20-somethings, we see a transition of gain, if you will, not a transition of loss. We don't see this being something that ultimately, if it was just a loss, it took everything from us, we wouldn't see these types of life satisfaction scores, right, that we see around that type of pattern. So that's another piece of the puzzle, a part of our understanding here, is that we do see some of this well-being, particularly around the decreases in risk behavior. I should have brought the table on drunkenness and binge drinking. It's amazing how much those behaviors change among the married and the unmarried. And you do not see these patterns with cohabitation. So anybody arguing that marriage is just a piece of paper, you tell them, wow, let me get a piece of that paper, because that's magic, powerful paper, right? Because that is changing people's lives in big, big ways, that there's a reality, there's a different pattern with that, okay? And we see around that. It's very much the same. I use the analogy with cohabiting in marriage. It's a lot like homeowners and renters. How many of you are renting right now? How many of you would love for there to be new carpet in your apartment? How many of you are willing to pay for it? Where'd all the hands go? We got a few. I'm doing it. If I'm renting, I'm putting it in, right? You can do a very elaborate scientific study on this. Go stand outside Home Depot. It's Saturday today. Go down there. Anybody coming out of Home Depot, right, with a cart, you can't get the people who just have light bulbs, but somebody who's got a real cart of stuff, okay, and you ask them, I'm just doing a one-question survey, are you a homeowner or are you a renter? And what are you going to find out? Well, I can show you a picture of homeowners, I can show you a picture of renters, and you can't tell the difference, right? But their behaviors are very different. It's the same thing with cohabitation, same thing with marriage. Yeah, they're couples, but they're not the same. Do you know who knows this? This is an area where academics are like playing a crazy game. Because you know who really knows the best that cohabitation is not like marriage? Joe and Jane Cohabiter. You know that, don't you, right? Go to Joe Cohabiter and say, hey, I heard that cohabitation and marriage, they're just the same, so why don't you marry her? And what's Joe going to do? Whoa, hey, did she put you up to, did her mom put you up to that? No. He knows darn well that marriage contract, right, that marriage covenant, that's very different than that cohabiting bargain. Oh, now all of a sudden I have to be, our finances, our time, my involvement with her extended family, it all changes, right? So where do we see the different benefits? Why does marriage produce them and we don't see it with other couple types and other relationship types? Because it's fundamentally different. It promotes and has a different type of living, a different way that occurs. And Linda Waite and others have documented this, and this study just simply extends it down into the 20s as well, that we see those types of patterns and issues there. A couple more things here, and then I want to open this up to question and answer, and we can talk a little bit more. But perhaps the area that most people pay attention to, I know definitely young adults pay attention to, it's the marital outcomes data, right? Because when we play this notion and try to figure out when is the on time or the best age of marriage, it's not just our notion of what is on time, it also becomes our definition of what is early, predominantly, because that's what we focused on. We have a whole generation of research on teenage marriage, and so we have a definition, of early. But when we say early, what we really mean is too early, right? So if we're saying too early, what does that imply? They're not going to succeed, right? Now, if there's anything we can capture in the social sciences, that's about as simple of a question as you can get. Because it's also about as hard of measures as we get. I mean, poor Scott Stanley's out at the University of Denver trying to figure out how to measure sacrifice, right? I mean, he's a trooper to take on a measure like that. I'll go with this. I'll measure age. You know, Scott's introducing his scale of here's how you measure sacrifice. And say, well, here's my item of how you measure age. We figure that everybody does it the same, right? It kind of works. It's not that hard to measure. And then the other issue we have is when we look at marital outcomes, definitely of stability. We look at divorce patterns. We've got very clear ways that we measure those as well. Okay? So let's look at what we're finding. And this is where I think things are in this change. This is where I think the next 5 to 10 years we've got to go in some new directions. Because what we've known now for a very long time is that when you ask the question, does age of marriage influence divorce? The answer is yes and no. And that's not just that wishy-washy social science, it depends answer. Right? Yes and no. What does the actual association of two variables look like if it's yes and no? Well, it looks like that. You see the yes part of the association? So to orient you to this graph, what we see here, this is age of marriage, starting with the census data. They start at age 15. I don't know why, but that's where they start, right? So we go age of marriage this way, right? So we're increasing in age. And then what you see here is probability of disruption. You can roughly interpret that as a percentage of divorce, of couples who marry at that time of divorce, okay? So what do we see? When the ages are very low, the probability of disruption is very high. As age increases, what happens to that association? What do we see happening? Very strong association between those variables. We're seeing a large marriage benefit. In fact, early on in those teenage years like that, this is one of the strongest predictors we have of marital outcomes like divorce. Okay? And we've known that for years. In fact, we're going to talk in a minute how I think that right there has really shaped how we've thought about this issue in some ways that we need to reconsider. But notice what happens right as we get into the early 20s. This is Tim Heaton's work using the large census data, right, that we see. It's the same trend and pattern we see in all the other data sets too. What happens to that age benefit? It goes flat, or pretty close to flat. We'll come back to that pretty close in just a minute. But it goes flat. I mean, it turns. If you know another variable that does this, please send me that example. I'm looking for it. It's odd, right? You can see things taper off. You can see things start to change a little bit. But to just pivot, right? And when it goes flat, what does that mean? Is there association between the variables? No. Increased age of marriage now is not buying us much. Now, everyone looks at that graph and says, but it does a little bit down there. There is a little bit of a tapering. And you're right. We've known for years now that couples who marry in their late 20s, particularly those who marry after the age of 30, have the lowest divorce rates. Okay? Now, be careful how you interpret that, okay? Because it's not dramatically different than this, but it is somewhat different, okay? So we've taken this notion of this linear relationship, right? We see this strong linear relationship, and we carry it forward. So the general consensus when it comes to marriage outcomes is the older is better. In fact, I don't know why we're not marrying at age 80. I mean, there's a powerful argument there that it'll just kind of keep going. I mean, and retirement will be set. I mean, it'll all be taken care of, right? We go back to this morning's conversation about fertility. We will come into some different conclusions there, right? But here's what I want you to pay attention to. And here's what our team's been paying attention to the last few years, because I want to show you some new data. Back in 2010, Norval Glenn at the University of Texas released a study that is a game changer. It's not that striking of an idea, but the findings change things dramatically. What Glenn did is he says, whoa. We shouldn't just measure marital quality by stability, right? The absence of divorce isn't the simple indicator of a good marriage. So he said in his study, he said, I'm at least going to include marital satisfaction, right? Let's at least ask people how happy they are and combine this. Now, Glenn's a sociologist, so he pulled together 5 national data sets, right, that would allow him to do this. So he's working with these 5 data sets. Really encourage you to go back and look at his study of what he does when he brings this together and puts both divorce potential and also sees the satisfaction, he finds something quite different. In their analysis of the 5 American data sets that indicated that later marriages entered into in the late 20s and 30s fare very well in stability, like we just saw, but rather poorly in quality. They found evidence that there's a curvilinear relationship between age of marriage and marital happiness, and that the greatest likelihood of being in an intact marriage of the highest quality, using their measures, is among those who marry between the ages of 22 and 25. Now, when I say that's a game changer, because that just dropped everybody's jaws. What? I mean, even in Provo we said, what? Really? That's a pretty different trend, pretty different pattern that we saw there. Although we do see how much that flattens out. So, what do we do here? Well, one last thing. So here's Glenn's conclusion of his data, looking at those 5 data sets. He says, quote, marital success apparently increases with age at marriage only up to the early to mid-20s, with increases in marital survival beyond those ages resulting entirely from a greater tendency for persons to remain in mediocre or poor marriages. So our assumption there that these more stable older marriages were because these were the best quality marriages aren't holding up, at least with Glenn's analysis. In the Not Yet report, we went back and said, can we replicate that? Do we see that with other data sets? Replication is a critical part of the social science enterprise, right? Sampling always has some ways to throw some curveballs. We always like to see what we can do with multiple data sets. This is Brad Wilcox's data at the University of Virginia from the National Fatherhood Initiative and the National Marriage Survey. So it is a national survey. It's of a smaller scale, but he does have national representation. Looking at adults at the age of about 40, between 35 and 40, looking at age of marriage, and in that data set we could also look at marital quality broadly defined. Had they divorced or stayed together, and if they were still together, were they happy or unhappy? Now, if you get oriented to this graph, this starts to capture the pattern that Glenn was really talking about. So again, we have age of marriage moving across below 20, 20 to 23, 24 to 26, 27 to 29, 30 plus. But then what he has is the percentages of those adults in each of those 3 categories. So among those who are under the age of 20 when they married, we only see 31% that are still married and are very happy. We see 17% that are still married and they're not very happy, and we see 52% that are no longer married, right? We've seen that. That's that stability graph we were just looking at. But notice the ratios, how they change. As they move forward here to the mid-20s, we see the largest ratio of those that are together and happy, the smaller piece of that, and then we see the smallest amount around that aspect of or slightly higher. So notice the contrast to that to the plus 30 marriages that Glenn was targeting. We do see the lowest divorce group, right? We see that smallest 8%, but we also see a very large together but not very happy in the relationship. So this has us challenging and thinking about marital quality, and it's introducing, quite simply to put it statistically, we're now grappling with, is there truly a curvilinear relationship? What would explain that? Where does that come from? What would be the patterns around that? Really quickly here with our time. At the Relate Institute at BYU, we have a data set as well that while we don't have the sampling of the large census data sets, we have much stronger measurement than they do. So we're not just saying, hey, are you still together and are you happy? We're able to climb inside the dynamics of the relationship. So this is a study that is still in process, so I wanted to share a little bit of the new data with you as we're running preliminary analysis. So what we've done is gone in and created a large data set from our data. We've broken it into 4 categories. So we have adolescent marriages, early marriages. So the adolescents are before the age of 20. The early marriages are 20 to 24. Normative marriage is 25 to 30. And the later marriage is for those who married after the age of 30. But like I said, what we're able to do in this data set is go back and look at a number of things. We look at personal characteristics. There's a long-standing literature that shows us that the different characteristics of the spouses is often predictive of relationship outcomes. So in particular, I want to show you data on marital importance. So this is how much the spouses are rating marriage as an important part of their life goals and plans. We also look at the self-esteem levels, which is kind of a general measure of emotional well-being. We also look at positive outlook, which is really just a reverse-coded depression scale. So to keep them all in the same trend. So that's the absence of depression and doing well in that way. We also have the ability to look at marital processes in this data set. So we look at sexual quality in the relationship. This is measured as a three-pronged measurement. This is measured by the frequency of sexual activity in the relationship, the reported satisfaction with that, then also a reverse-coded problems measure. So saying it's not a problem area. We don't have disagreements. We don't have fights around that. So that's our marital, our sexual quality measure. And then also we have a quality of communication scale, very Gottman-esque. John Gottman helped us develop that. We're capturing the quality of communication within the relationship and the ability to handle conflict appropriately. And then we too came in and looked at satisfaction stability, but we also added our broad measure of problem areas, which is an area of how much disagreement and fighting is happening in the relationship. So again, our goal here is to see, could we find that same curvilinear relationship, and would some richer measurement here help us perhaps start to explain it? And we want to be careful about explanation, right? Not a longitudinal data set. We're not following people over time, but we are at least getting a little bit more of a richer picture of their relationships. Notice here, let me just walk us through this a bit. Self-esteem data, what do we see? The alphabetic superscripts there just show the statistical differences between groups. So which group is different when it comes to self-esteem level? It's our early marriage group, right? So that helps us understand our long-standing understanding of early marriage patterns struggling. But notice this blue one here. The blue one is the importance of marriage. Which two groups do we see being the highest? It's actually our early marrying groups. As we move into the late 20s and the plus 30s group, we see an on average of that decreasing, right? So there's an area there that we're wondering, is there a selection element of this? Is this part of what's being brought into those later relationships? And then this positive outlook, again, we see risk for that lower group, right, the early marrying group, but we don't see it for those other groups. Perhaps our most notable findings in this preliminary study is our couple process data. The red line that you're looking at there is our sexual quality measure. So we see a curvilinear relationship here, but we see it particularly dropping off, mirroring what Glenn has found in his piece there of seeing a higher portion of couples that have very stable relationships, but this part, which is an indication perhaps of some of the passion, the intimacy, the energy in that relationship, dropping off quite dramatically for those later marrying couples than we see in those marrying in the early to mid-20 patterns. And we see the same type of curvilinear relationship happening with communication too. So there might be some areas there that we can start to look at and we can start to tease apart. And then the last graph I just want to show you here is that looking at our measures of relationship outcomes, we also find some indication of this curvilinear relationship. So the point I just wanted to make to you is we're up to 7 data sets now. Up to 7 data sets are finding this curvilinear pattern. And that's why I say it's a game changer. Because we have for an entire generation had a conversation in this country about the risks of teenage marriage. But I think we've extended that into this idea that that linear relationship keeps going. And now we're starting to see the possibility of later relationships, perhaps introducing some other areas of risk. Now again, probability, right? Population statistics. You don't run to grandma and say, Grandma, you got married when you were 18, right? Well, I went to Love and Fidelity and I found out that you and Grandpa are going to divorce. It's right there. But we've been married for 60 years, honey. I know, but any day now, Grandpa's he's going to spring it on you, right? So it's not a one-to-one correlation, right? That's not saying not everybody before, that marries in their teenage years is doomed. And we're certainly not saying the same thing about those older marriages either. But again, we're looking at some average patterns, some average trends around that. So some last thoughts, and then I'm very anxious to hear your thoughts and your views, which are probably mostly about lunch. I think it's very important to see this the right way. To me, what I think we're looking at is the notion here of perhaps this window of opportunity. I would not get overly hung up in this whole 22 versus 24 versus 28, and where exactly. You saw how different studies are carving it up a little bit different. We can sit and debate about those edges all the time. I think it's the broader patterns. We see very clear risk patterns in those teenage marriages where one or both of the partners are a teenager, and what we're starting to see is the emergence, and particularly of this plus 30 group. Why is that worth noting? Well, go back and look at the national data right now. How many people are marrying in their teenage years? Some, but not that many. It's decreasing. How many are marrying plus 30? Well, the graphs keep going the direction they're going, it's going to be the new average. It'll be the new norm, right? We'll see sizable portions of the population. So that's the part, I think, in this age of marriage discussion that needs more investigation, more view of, because that's the area that we're moving into as the new demographic reality. In some ways, we're making a really good case against the 1950s, but that's not where we're at anymore, and those trends have shifted and changed. One thing we always have to add into this, and our data doesn't get into it, but we always have to keep in mind this idea of a dynamic versus a static dating pool. We tend to talk about the opportunities for marriage and dating. It's a little bit like milk at the grocery store, right? Hey, whenever you're ready, just go down and pick some up. The grocery store has always got milk. Go pick some milk up. Lerner and others in their work are really pushing on the notion that some of the reason why we're seeing a flattening of the benefit of increased age of marriage might be because that dating pool is substantially changing. And that by the time we get into that, both the context of coupling and the possibilities for coupling might be an area. We have very little data on that, despite what the dating companies tell you, right? We got all the science, we got all this figured out. Every time they say that, all the marriage scholars are going, really? Where's the study? I want to see. They don't have it. One of the other things here is not so much just the risk of the later marriages. I think one of the things to pay attention to is we're seeing some interesting data on the strength of the earlier marriages, particularly those in the early to mid-20s, which in some people's views are quickly becoming seen as not all that different than a teenage marriage, right? 23? What? It's like 17. I've had that before. I've had people grab me at conferences and say, "You're the guy promoting teenage marriage." What? Where is that guy? Where did that come from? No, yeah, you're in the early marriage stuff. I'm just looking at some patterns here and saying things look pretty different. I'm struck by the strength we see in a number of those relationships. So it might be as much of us evaluating the culture that when people have those opportunities and they desire to pursue those, what's our reaction? Are we in a supportive position with that as a broader culture, as family groups? Or are we in that pattern that says that's a recipe for disaster? Well, the data shows us there's plenty of patterns there where it's not a disaster. So that might be an element, too, that fits into our marriage piece of this. I talked to you about choice and constraint. I think this is a huge thing to look at people's desired patterns and how much it's matching up with their actual patterns. The other thing here, too, is if you keep Heaton's graph there of that flattening out, we do have to acknowledge the reality that after the early 20s, age of marriage continues to have some predictive pattern, but it's not really big. So in some ways, what the overall conclusion might be is that after we reach a certain point of maturation, it's really not the factor we should be paying attention to. We should be changing our culture, and rather than setting arbitrary ages of, well, until you're 23 or 25 or 30 or 80 or whatever that is, to say, no, once we've reached that point, which seems to be in that early 20s, definitely mid-20s pattern, we need to be fostering much more of the culture of, well, what are the factors then that do predict? What are those healthy partner characteristics? What are those healthy couple patterns to encourage that? And when that's present, whether the couple's 22, 28, or 32, that's what's going to be far more predicting the trajectory of that relationship rather than just simply focusing on the age of those patterns. So let's open it up to questions. I'm interested in the directions you'd like to go, things we can tie into. We can stay close to the data we've talked here too, or we can go in some other directions that this might have triggered some thoughts or some ideas for you.
Thanks very much.
Oh,
Now, we can take some questions for Professor Carroll. Does the videographer need me to repeat the questions? Okay, we're still doing that. That's fine. I'll just say that I was struck by some of your bar graphs that show that men in all the different groups you're studying, men get more satisfaction and experience less depression as a result of marriage. And as I saw those bar graphs, I thought to myself, that's just exactly what my wife is always telling me. So first question, please. Here, second chair from the aisle there. Thanks, Serena. Okay, so different religions have different understandings of marriage, different teachings on marriage. How much of a difference does it make? Do your data show a difference in interreligious marriage and how those work out?
Our data doesn't speak to this directly, but the overall research line on that is very clear. Interfaith marriages have a particular struggle. There's a couple of things that elevate or exacerbate that difficulty. Children, right? So it's one thing to say, hey, we'll be fine when we're in engagement and courtship and early marriage, and then when children start to hit baptismal age and those types of things, starts to be a little bit of a different pattern. The other thing that we've generally found is that, for lack of a better term, what we might call lifestyle religions, it's even more of a pattern. So when it's very much 24/7, middle of the week, my religion is a key part of my identity and how I live. That's a little bit different than kind of a Sabbath only, definitely a Christmas, Easter attending individual. So the more you have one or both partners emphasizing and participating in those types of faiths, we see a number of struggles. And so there's no doubt this would tie in. The other thing that would tie into it would be if there's prescriptions within the faith to marry within the faith, right? So then something like that is probably going to be a higher selection criteria for somebody than simply age. And they would generally acknowledge that to marry at a particular age, if it didn't have that type of selection criteria, would be quite different. So yeah, there's a richness in there. There's a literature that spent quite a bit of time with it. Annette Mahoney would be a particularly good scholar to look at some of the stuff that she's done around interfaith marriage.
Great question.
How much of it is that generally more mature people tend to enter into marriages and therefore they do better on these criteria? And how much is it actually caused by being married itself? I mean, I'm sure it's some of both, but can you speak to that breakdown?
Linda Waite sure can. University of Chicago, Linda Waite, Case for Marriage. The only way you can tease that, well, there's two ways you can tease it out. One you can't do. It's called a random clinical trial, right? So if you could take people and assign half of them to get married and not get married randomly, that would really be the best way to tease that out. But since we can only do that with plants and we can't do that with people, our best approach to that is longitudinal studies, right? We follow people over time. Because in our culture today, we have a kind of a living experiment where we clearly have people entering into the marriage state, and we also have people exiting it. So what you're really talking about is the selection versus causation argument around these marriage impacts. If it's a selection effect, we're saying, hey, whoa, the people that are healthy, the people that are more attractive, the people that are wealthier or doing better, they're just more likely to get married, right? So that's just a spurious effect. Is there really any argument of causation? So Linda Waite has spent the better part of her career the last 15 years teasing that apart. We didn't have the data to do that with the 20-somethings. But the general pattern we've had come back from those longitudinal studies is to say, you're right, it's probably an element of both, but there's a very strong argument that there's a very big part of that is causation. Because we see health profiles elevate as people enter into the marriage state, and we see health profiles go back down when they leave it. So when we track them over time, we see something happening. Again, the idea of marriage is simply a piece of paper. There's a way of living. There's a dynamic there. Linda likes to talk, for example, about the virtues of spousal nagging. And you say, really, nagging? But, for example, married men, much, much more likely to get good health care and visit the doctor and visit the dentist than single men. Well, Linda would tell you that's because they get to have interesting dinner conversations that say, when's the last time you went, and shouldn't you get that checked out? And it's a simple example, but it's an example of a direct mechanism of why would we see better health among those married men, right, than we would among singles. And she would argue too in ways that cohabiting couples can't do either. So our data doesn't have it in the not yet report, but the general trends from Linda's work and others would tell us that there's still plenty of causation in the mix. Yeah, so the question is, if you didn't catch that, she's going back to that data point we had where it shows, this is the ad health data. So this is our very best, 90,000 participant longitudinal study on teenagers in the country that's gone well now into the early 30s. So that's where we're looking at that from. So it's a very good data source. And the data does show us that 50% of men by age 25, half of them, 25%, right, are married, and another 25% report that they want to be married or desire to be married. And among women, it's just a little bit over 30 are married by age 25, 30%, and another 50% are reporting that they'd like to be. My bet, I'd have to go back and look at the ad health data. If we had Brian Willoughby here right now, he'd just know it immediately. He was our lead analyst for the ad health data. My bet is they're in the desire to be category. I think it had to be marital status to be in that other category. And then it was another question brought in to say, no, I don't know if someone's engaged and they say they don't want to be married, then they're probably falling into that other group too. So I just think it was that desire item combined with those that actually reported the marital status.
So the question is, in a collegiate culture, grad school culture in which people have a lot of sexual relations but are putting off marriage, when they finally decide, they home in on this, I want to get married, where are they in their relationship with a person who's suitable for them to get married? Is that kind of what you're asking?
They find themselves in a relationship with someone that they weren't really planning on getting married with, but then all of a sudden the marriage switch turns on.
The marriage switch turns. Is that kind of the way it happens?
Scott Stanley, University of Denver. This is like It's a Small World tour of my favorite scholars. That's the heart and soul of his sliding versus deciding theory. Right? He tested it primarily with cohabitation, saying we select a cohabitation partner with a very different set of criteria, kind of like selecting a roommate. Right? So we select that. We're not intentionally selecting someone to marry. We're not picking them as a spouse. It's a lower set of more temporary criteria. And then what happens is, to use Norval Glenn's term, the couple becomes prematurely entangled. Right? So they get those entanglements, and Stanley's idea is that then we have what he calls relationship inertia. That couple then starts to move forward. Other things entangle, right? Definitely the sexual relationship. Having a child would be an extreme form of entanglement. And next thing you know, those are the sliders who slide into marriage. And Stanley says that's the main explanation he sees for why cohabiting couples have higher divorce rates, not lower, because of that type of pattern. Right? So that pattern, I think, has some really strong evidence that it is occurring. There is such thing as the hookup that lingers, right? Every hookup is not ending with the walk of shame, right? There's plenty of those. Well, come on, I'm at BYU and I know what that means. Right? The idea that it just ends, right? The person's got to walk back home wearing the clothes that they had the night on before, and no relationship. You're right, there's hookups that linger. The study that you might want to look at, I didn't bring it up today because it's what I presented on last time at Love and Fidelity, but it's still one of my favorites. Busby, Carroll, and Willoughby in the Journal of Family Psychology. We're looking at sexual restraint patterns versus sexual compatibility patterns. It's the sexual timing thing. What we're finding is couples who come together and it's because of sexual initiation, that right at the beginning of that's how they kind of come together and then they create a relationship. Even if they go on to get married, we see those couples faring much differently in marriage than those who had a sexual restraint pattern where the relationship and commitment came first and then the sexuality was added. So we've been trying to extend Stanley's work on cohabitation into the sexual timing aspect. And then our newest study that we just barely published looked at number of sexual partners, because that's the other problem. When people have that pattern, by the time they enter into marriage, they tend to be the ones who have high numbers of sexual partners. And that too we find to be a very strong risk factor for later marital success, later marital sexuality, other types of patterns. So the biggest thing, your thinking's right on. Your thinking's right on. How a couple forms and how they come together matters. And so that relationship history and the timing and sequence of it all, very little research on it though. We need a lot more to really get that sequence and pattern of how couples are coming together, because not all relationships are created equally.
So what case is there or is there not for intentional cohabitation, actually planning to do this as a kind of trial or probationary period before you tie that knot?
If all we had was Stanley's data, we might be a little bit stumped. You put that with our sexual timing data, because unless they've got a totally different definition of cohabitation that doesn't involve sexual involvement, you're still talking about a relationship where the sexual timing predates the commitment. And there's a selection pattern there that is different, and there is a relationship development pattern there that is different. Sexuality is experienced differently in the context of commitment than in the absence of it. We're living in our generation is in the great, starting with Masters and Johnson and all the way back, we've entered into this whole physiological discussion of sexuality, right? Every sex therapy class I've ever been trained in, right, it's all based on the physiology of the sexual response. And so when we do that, we can get into that kind of deception of believing that somehow it's just, sex is just sex and it's just happening here, it's just happening there. Well, that's great if we're just physical creatures, but we're absolutely not. Pick your language system, right? Definitely many of us would pull from our faith systems, but go to attachment theory, go to, other language systems and say, clearly we don't engage in sexuality with just our bodies, right? Our minds, our emotions, our spirits, our souls are all a part of that. And so that symbolic aspect of that is huge for a couple. And so there's no way to change that. You can be as intentional as you want. You can have a starter cohabitation all you want and decide if you want to upgrade to the next house or, rent to own option or whatever that is with a relationship. It doesn't change the fact that both of them are not in with both feet. That's back to that analogy earlier. They're not going to be acting as homeowners. This is one of the big myths of general relationship formation in society today. In fact, it happens for far too many of us and people that we're trying to influence. The idea is, when I finally have a really great relationship, I'm going to commit to it. You see the faulty logic there? Where do really great relationships come from? Committed people. Committed people who make the sacrifices, make the investments, So in some ways, you cannot test marriage with cohabitation, ever. Because it's a completely different relationship. Until both feet are in, both people are committed, both people are sacrificing, that's what's going to create a really great relationship. And it's a faulty argument, even academic or otherwise, to pretend that it's not.
I think that, Charles Murray's recent work has suggested what the questioner just mentions, which is the higher income correlates strongly with durable marriage and no children out of wedlock or fewer children out of wedlock. So what light can we shed on this?
I would add, though, part of what we highlighted today, most of that work is focused on stability. So it's similar to the other stuff that we've seen. If we broaden our definition of quality, right, because we see it in the data here too, right? The higher income is also connected to the later age marriages. We do see better stability, but we don't necessarily see higher quality in those relationships. So that might be another form of a trade-off, right, in that type of pattern. So I think that's something we'd have to pay attention to around that. There's no doubt that there's a combination. It's what people are referring to as the success sequence, right? That if we have those elements of career and financial preparation, we have marriage, and then we have children, right? In fact, I didn't talk about this too much. This idea of a success sequence, but what we might need to change is it may not necessarily, because I haven't seen any data that really focuses simply on sequence as much as it is about foundation factors. So in none of the data sets that we looked at, for example, could you find when the timing of marriage or the degree happened. You just ended up in the category, right? So if someone was to marry yet still complete their degree, There didn't seem to be any disadvantage to that than someone who completed their degree and then married. So it is also a pattern which in the current context is radical. It's not so radical at BYU, but that's radical in other places. We have a lot of post-marital education at BYU, right? So it's, I don't know, maybe it's some little sample I need to look at, but we have a number of folks that marry, but they're still committed to these foundation factors and completing degrees and completing schooling and those kind of things. A generation or two ago, that wasn't radical at all. We saw post-marital education all the time. The key is, what we've seen shift is we've moved as a culture to what we refer to in the report as a capstone model of marriage. You get everything in adult life all put together, you get everything worked out, you get everything, and then you can cap it off with marriage when you're all ready, right? Makes a lot of sense, sounds very logical, but it is generationally very different than what we've seen previously, where previous generations had more of what you might call a cornerstone model, where marriage came earlier. You still did career preparation, you still bought homes. I mean, our data says that 40% of young people today believe they need to be a homeowner before they could get married. I mean, when you start putting those types of criteria for marriage readiness, well, of course marriage is getting pushed further and further off. But you're also creating something that great-grandma doesn't make sense to her, right? Yeah, they wanted to be homeowners, but those were often seen as steps in couple life, in married life. And you want my real take on this? I need better data, so I'll go into the theory part of this. Part of it is because we're creating a divorce readiness culture in some ways, rather than a marriage readiness culture. So in some ways, it's as much about, are you ready for the worst case scenario? And if you can, well, go ahead and put your eggs in that marriage basket. That's a pretty different thing than saying live and prepare for best case scenario. And be wise. Any of us can find ourselves in situations that aren't exactly what we plan or ideal. But I think there is a difference if we have an entire generation that's so focused on worst case scenario, they don't really focus on or come towards this idea of best case scenario. So there's a lot more, if you get the broader marriage quality element to it, we can play with it. But it's not an either or equation, right? It needs to be seen as, it's important. We saw that with those education levels. It makes a real difference, and we do see it connected to relationship outcomes, but it doesn't necessarily dictate that has to be the sequence or the pattern that it occurs.
I want to ask a quick question myself. I think I can safely say, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that later marriage, late 20s, early 30s, beyond, is also strongly associated with fertility decline and smaller family size, right? Fewer children. If you start later, fewer children.
Without a doubt.
Okay.
Without a doubt.
So what's the impact of that? I don't think you mentioned it here, but how does that variable figure into the relationship satisfaction data you're seeing?
Well, I was thinking about that as I listened to the session this morning, and we talk about satisfaction with life and those different patterns. It's got to be there to some degree. I'm not aware of anything that looks at it directly, but there's no doubt if we go back to that societal level, we see in the countries where age of marriage has moved and has continued to move. And we're headed in that direction here in the United States. We're right there playing with that replacement rate, right, depending on the data set. And there's no doubt that this does come together as a package deal for the broader culture and the broader society. So they don't separate out, they tie together. So fertility, family patterns, replacement rates in societies will also be tied to this. That's why I think it is, the biggest thing I think we need is just a broader conversation. I don't think, I'm nowhere near believing that I have all these answers for where we should go, but we're not even really having the conversation. We've just assumed a linear relationship, and it's kind of been unquestioned that 30s, 40s, whatever it might be, more mature, more prepared, more ready, right, type of approach. There's some argument to some other models of relationship formation. That in fact getting later like that makes many people struggle with rigidity and the flexibility of creating a couple identity, and that marriage does get to be seen as a transition of loss because you've created such an individual lifestyle and pattern that you can't help but view your married life now as something that changed and upset the apple cart.
Speaking of dead on, that's just what you were, Jason. Please join me in thanking
Thanks, Matt.
Dr. Carroll.
Appreciate it.